for this morning session, for the input from Meg and Laura regarding Core Strand 1, and of course the excellent panelists that we had just before lunch. So diolch yn fawr, Fliss, thank you very, very much for arranging that. It really was a very, very valuable contribution to the module to have such renowned experts in the field to talk with us. I hope you had a quick break over lunch, had some fresh air, some water and some healthy food to keep you going for the afternoon. For the next hour and a half, Alison and I will be leading the session, and we will be breaking it up into quite a few activities just to keep everybody awake on a Saturday afternoon. There will be a short break in the middle. We have planned that, but we'll see how the time goes. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I will try and access the chat occasionally, but if there are quite a few questions coming, maybe Alison, you can draw my attention to that. Any documents I'll be referring to during the first part of the session, I've already uploaded to the chat. They are available on PebblePad. They are documents that you should have accessed previously, but just to jog your memory, they will be in the chat as well. So what are the aims of this afternoon? So Core Strand 2 builds on some of the elements that you received of regarding excellent practice in the previous ALN module, so the inclusive classroom practice module and the leadership and management of ALN. So you may want to return to some of the articles included there when you are doing your research for the assignment. If you haven't done either or modules, then some of the materials that we use there we've also included at the beginning of this module, so they are there for you. But the focus is different here, isn't it? It's a focus on a whole setting approach, and within the ALN code it says that ALN is the responsibility of every teacher. But I think we need to go one step further. And if you read the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education, they tell you that ALN is the responsibility of every practitioner. And if we are taking a whole school approach, that is what we need to consider. Now, in looking at the aims of the session, you will see, as with the aims that Meg shared for their session this morning, that the word critically appears here 3 times. And this is the important aspect of studying at master's level. You need, in your discussions this afternoon now, in your discussions, try and be critical, not judgmental. You're not your local consortia person coming in to judge your effectiveness. You're not testing. You are critically reflecting on your own and others' practice based on your readings, based on your experience. You know, what does Mel Ainscough tell us about best practice in other countries about inclusion and equity? Consider what the panel talked about this morning. You know, to what extent does the excellent practice that already exists within your setting align with the vision that's already been shared with you today? But criticality is a lot more than that as well. It's about being skeptical of what you do, your practice, your everyday practice, and being skeptical of what we share with you as academics within the Saturdays, and also being skeptical about what you read. In your discussions, I would recommend that you take on Tom Chatfield's advice on critical thinking, and this is what he says it is. And I think this is good advice. Take it and keep it in mind as we move through the afternoon. Disagree, debate, inquire, and question as much as you like. Just make sure you understand exactly what it is you disagree with in the first place, and then try and work out exactly why you disagree, and what a better account might look like. So I think that's excellent advice, not only for the discussions, but also when you move on to your assignments. So the 3 topics we will be exploring and focusing on this afternoon, and you might want to choose one of these for your assignment, for your audit, are effective personalised provision, where we'll be looking at PCP and reviews, extent to which learner voice, Article 12 of the UNCRC, the United Nations on the Conventions of the Rights of the Child, are enacted, as noted in the ALN bill. And then finally, looking at communication skills and how effective communication is key for all stakeholders within the ALN process. So in the chat, I have posted there the Welsh Government guidance from 2015 that Rhiannon referred to in her introduction this morning. It is on Pebblepad as well, in addition to other sources regarding PCP. And we've looked at person-centred practice, PCP, in our 2 previous modules. So that's why we're sharing some of the material with you again. And the person-centred practice focuses on the ALN code and how that provision for the child includes the voice of the child and includes the strengths of the child, the interests of the child, and what they want to achieve their targets. But personalised provision is a lot more than that as well. Personalised provision is a strengths-based approach. It's about a can-do approach rather than a can't-do, which is in line, of course, with the social model of disability. Now, we asked you to look at 3 articles that related to this. And how it is viewed within the different articles. And I thought it might be useful just to recap, what these articles tell us about personalised provision. Now, the first one, the European Agency article, looks at raising the achievement for all learners and not only those with ALN. And personalised provision is good practice for all, whether you have an additional learning needs, or whether you have an additional learning difference, or whether you need provision that is slightly different maybe to the overall provision that is provided for the rest of the class. And what the European agency tells us is it's not just a policy initiative, it's not just good practice, but it's an ethical obligation. It's about raising learner aspirations and participation. It's a vision that everybody can achieve with the right support in place. And this is not just looking at academic achievement. It's to do with personal, social, wider achievement as well. And if you think about that in the context of Curriculum for Wales, it is about supporting and developing those capable learners and those confident individuals, the purposes that drive our curriculum. There's also a focus on equity rather than equality. Equality is giving everyone an equal opportunity to make progress and to achieve, where equity is the basis of personalised provision because it looks at what each individual needs in order to succeed, those with additional learning needs and disabilities, as those with learning differences such as ACEs, EAL, socioeconomic status, etc. What this document also tells us is that in order for personalised provision to be effective, we need to build teachers' professional knowledge and expertise in order to meet the diverse needs that are within the context of the classroom and the school. And hopefully, in looking at excellence in practice with ALN, that this will support you in your professional development. It looks at evidence-informed practice. And quite interestingly, a point that I think Chris brought up this morning was about networking. And networking is something that will inform your practice, evidence of what works in other contexts. So the excellence practice that's already been identified can be put into practice here. It's also about embedding the growth mindset approach that Laura and Meg talked to about this morning. So in personalised provision, it's a flexible curriculum and it's inclusive assessment processes. Now, the second document that you looked at was the Education Endowment Foundation guidance that was published recently. And I've put links to all three documents in the chat for you. It's under task 1. So the Education Endowment Foundation talk about an inclusive approach and inclusive ethos. And there's one point there that really is in a bit of a disagreement with what Jean Ware shared with us this morning. She mentioned that the language wasn't important, but they look at language here, and this is something that I've looked at previously, and how you use and model language within your classroom and within the school. So how are learners with additional learning needs referred to? Is it that ALN learner? Is that autistic child in year 4? Is that an inclusive approach? Well, for me, the child always comes first. The learner always comes first. The young person always comes first. So if you are using inclusive terminology, it is the learner with additional learning needs, the learner with autistic spectrum disorder, the learner with Down syndrome. He or she always comes first, and modeling that language shows that you value that individual. This document also talks about developmental patterns and the complexity of needs. Developmental isn't linear, and progression isn't linear. There's regression as well as progression when you look at individual learners with additional learning needs. The complexity of needs can increase with age, or they can decrease with age, despite the right provision being in place. So we need to consider this when we look at personalised provision. Personal characteristics is also a huge influence. A one size does not fit all. So the support provided, the environment that the individual is in, needs to be flexible to their gender, to their age, to their disposition, to their previous experiences, to their preferences, to their interests. And I think Dr. Jean Ware provided some excellent example this morning, didn't she, when she mentioned the quiet space for a child to work in, where that individual could not work in a noisy, cluttered environment. And also that other young person who chose with visual impairment, who chose to go to specialist provision. So it's looking at whether the environment is also conducive to personalised learning. There are some recommendations within the document, and I'm sure you can return to look at those following this session. But this is quite a useful document to read prior to the audit in order for you to identify aspects of provision and what is effective practice. And we'll look at reflecting on that later on during the afternoon. Now, the third document that we asked you to look at is quite an interesting one as well. It's a policy from one of the states in Australia. And Australia is a country that we look to for excellent practice when it comes to well-being. But there is some excellent practice there as well when it comes to additional learning need. And quite interestingly, It acknowledges personalised learning as a process. It and acknowledges and celebrates the diversity of students. And emerging research shows us that Curriculum for Wales is a process-orientated curriculum. And Donaldson's vision was for it to be more inclusive. So there is a link there between what excellent practice within ALN looks like and what the vision for Curriculum for Wales is. It also claims that research proves a personalised learning and support approach improves academic achievement of all pupils, including those with additional learning needs. The first document said that we needed to look beyond the academic, but this one focuses more on the academic. Again, the need for collaboration of stakeholders is key for effective and positive personalised learning. It's an approach that values diversity, it's more inclusive, and it addresses the unique learning differences and benefits all. Now we will move on to our first activity. So we did ask you to look at 2 of the 3 articles, and I've given you sort of a very brief synopsis of all 3 there. So based on that article, think of 5 to 7, maybe it depends on the time that you have and on how much you discuss, examples of best practice, and then within your own setting. And I'd like you to consider then how these examples of best practice will raise the achievement of all learners with additional learning needs. Another activity that you had on PebblePad was to prepare a concept map with examples of best practice in raising achievement. So if you've done that, then this is an opportunity for you to share that. And we are going to send you now to breakout rooms for 10 minutes to discuss this. Policy, and we'll look now at policy and practice. Now, there are a range of policies that influence your practice with pupils with additional learning needs, and these come at so many different levels, don't they? If you think about international policies to start off with, you have your United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, which I've already mentioned. You also have, and particularly if any of you are working with post-compulsory education learners, you have the United Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. That is still relevant to children as well. You have the Equality Act 2010. You have the Salamanca Statement on Inclusion. All those international policies impact on what is excellent practice. At national level, the most influential one within your practice, of course, is the ALN and Education Tribunal Act 2018. But there are other curriculum policies that also influence your day-to-day practice and the way that you ensure equity for your learners. The national mission launched by the former Education Minister Kirsty Williams in 2017. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act Wales in 2015. That's a key instrumental piece of legislation in influencing everything that we do in ensuring the well-being of learners with additional learning needs. And now, of course, you have Curriculum for Wales. So there are lots of national policies that influence. At local level, you might have policies that have been recommended by consortia. You might have local authority policies, as well as your own school policies. But you need to think not only of those that focus specifically or directly on additional learning needs, but you need to think wider as well. Yes, of course, your ALN policy, your inclusion policy, but what about your learning and teaching policy? How accessible, equitable, inclusive is that for learners with additional learning needs? What about the safeguarding policy, the wellbeing policy, the behaviour policy, the equal opportunities, health and safety? the curriculum policy, the anti-bullying. The list goes on and on. You know, it's not just about confining equity and inclusion and personalized learning within one particular policy that relates to additional learning needs. It needs to go right across the whole school policy. What you need to think about when you look at your local policies, your school policies in particular, do they reflect the strengths-based approach that we discussed previously? And to what extent are they flexible enough to include some of the key characteristics of what effective personalised provision is and of what excellent practice in ALN actually are? Policies are there to be implemented within your environment. You have to abide, some are statutory and some are non-statutory. But some of the non-statutory ones are up to interpretation. Therefore, consider to what extent your policy do promote an inclusive ethos, or whether they actually confine your personal practice. You know, that's something you need to think about. So we've reached our second task, and I know some of you have already looked at this. It's going back to the Education Endowment Foundation guidance, and this was an activity that we gave you in the Pebble Pad to look at this document and then to reflect to what extent your setting focuses on explicit instruction, on cognitive and metacognitive strategies, using technology, things we've already talked about. So in addition to looking at this, what I'd like you to do within the next, what time is it? We'll give you 5 minutes for this, as some of you have already looked at it. Can you please discuss your what you found out, your reflections on using this document? What were the strengths and weaknesses, and what are possible ways forward? And also, how useful was this document for you in identifying the strengths and weaknesses of provision? And this might be a starting point for you with your audit as well. So I put a link to this document in the chat, and I will send you to the breakout rooms shortly. And this time I will give you 5 minutes, and I will ask group 2 to feedback on this when we come back then, please. Pupils need to be, all pupils need to be aware of their rights according to the UNCRC, which I've already alluded to. And the Children's Commissioner promotes this within schools in Wales in particular, and the previous commissioner in particular did publish a few documents, a few research papers on ensuring the voices of those with additional learning needs, and those maybe that communicated in different ways could share their views. But the ALN code, doesn't it, outlines that the child's voice is important in the context of the PCP and in the context of the IDP, and in the context of the provision that is there for them. But the rights of the learner goes beyond this. It's even more. You know, examples of best practice of enacting the UNCRC articles are linked to equality, equity, and valuing the diversity of the learners within the setting. So if you're looking at excellent practice, you know, this should be firmly situated within the school development plan. It should permeate throughout learning and teaching, and promoted within the school ethos. So it's valuing the individual for who he or she is, their strengths, as well as aspects where they need further support. So non-discrimination should be, it should permeate across all aspects of school activities, reflecting the diversity of the learners within that setting. It's more than just, a wheelchair basketball club. It's things like representation of the school council, on the eco council, having all voices heard, and not only heard, what we heard from the panel this morning, and I think it was Dr. Jean Ware that mentioned this, being listened to. And I would go one step further, not only being listened to, but also being enacted upon, that you enact on the voice of the child as well. So all voices should be heard. So it's a consideration of what actually matters to those learners with additional learning needs. And it's empowering them really to be key stakeholders in whole setting decisions. Everything that affects their learning and their achievement. And again, more than their academic achievement, their achievement at a personal level, whether that be social, emotional, whatever, more than the academic. Empowerment is achieved through positive relationships, and we've talked a lot about collaboration and relationships and the importance of relationships today. Their participation should be encouraged, but also facilitated, enabling them to have that voice, being respected, their views being respected, and being treated inclusively. So developing the skills of participation, making themselves heard, and the setting acting upon those views leads to every learner within that setting accepting difference, and the views and opinions of all within that setting are valued. So again, it's that whole school approach. So this time, rather than send you to breakout rooms, I'd just like you to share as a whole group, to what extent does your setting implement a rights-based approach for learners with additional learning needs? Maybe you'd like to share an example of something that happens or something that you implement within your school that makes sure that the voices of those with additional learning needs are heard loud and clearly, that they're listened to, and that they are acted upon. Does anybody want to share?
So I'm just going to bring the strand to an end now, focusing with just a few slides on effective communication, and then I'll pass you on to Di, who'll provide you with a recap of the day. So I think the first thing that we might want to do is try to define what we mean by effective communication. I think might be easier to explain what communication is, but linking back to what was raised in the panel this morning when we were talking about meaning of excellence, meaning of inclusion, effective communication can also mean different things to different people. I mean, have we ever stood back and wondered what the people who we are communicating with are seeing? What are they thinking when we are conversing with them? And we've just got a sample here of some examples of what are deemed as effective communication skills. So things like verbal and non-verbal communication we might be familiar with. So you might have learners in your classroom who might communicate non-verbally, and I know we've touched on, Nana's raised this, and it was also raised this morning about the importance of knowing your learners' needs and recognizing perhaps when they are trying to communicate something with you in a non-verbal manner. So it would mean knowing their expression, maybe their body language, to enable you to find out, well, how are they feeling about this particular task, this lesson, and so on. Jean Ware raised about the importance of active listening and the difference between hearing somebody and actually listening. And very young children, especially children with additional learning needs, know whether you're listening to them or not. And an important factor here is empathy. So for them, it might be something relatively trivial that's worrying them. But for you it's trivial, but for them it's something major. So for you to be able to put yourselves into their own shoes to try and understand why it is they might have concerns, why they might be worried. Another factor that can raise is cultural awareness, what our expectations are in some of our schools and settings in relation to communication. And if you've got families from a variety of cultures, the implications that may arise from that. For example, eye contact can be something that is stipulated in relation to effective communication. I know when we're assessing oral presentations, for example, we emphasize this need for people to look at you and how it can make us feel if people don't look at us. However, there are some cultures where that is deemed unacceptable behaviour. It can be challenging for some, and we know, don't we, of learners with additional learning needs who are unable to give eye contact. Indeed, some find it quite painful to look at somebody directly. So all in all, it's quite a broad range of skills here. And think about the people that you communicate with on a daily basis, the number of people you might have in your setting, in your classroom, and so on. They're different roles, so you might have to adapt the way that you communicate in light of who it is you're speaking with. We're coming to the end of a school year. In September, there might be a change in the colleagues that you work with. So whether your line manager might be changing, whether you have a different teaching assistant or a learning support assistant in your classroom. And you might have an excellent rapport with staff that you've worked with for a time, but suddenly when there's a change in staffing, then the change in communication also has to be adapted. So just think about the assignment for it, as Rhiannon explained earlier, that perhaps communication or effective communication could be an area that you consider for the audit, whether that's you think of it as a barrier perhaps, or aspects of it could be a barrier for you in your schools and settings. Diolch, Nana. So as part of your preparatory work for today, under Substand 3, there were several examples of activities for you to undertake to help improve or to deepen your understanding of effective communication. And I'm always encouraged when we come across authors and researchers from Wales, because there aren't many out there. And believe it or not, when Nana and I put this lecture together, we had no idea that Jean Ware was going to be on the panel. So that's a happy accident, if you like. And of course, Rhiannon Packer and her co-authors. Rhiannon is part of the ALM team. So we've got a wealth of information here for you. So I'm aware of time, so I don't want to spend too much time sort of re-summarising the two papers. I think what's more important is your time to discuss and to feedback. But when you go into your breakout rooms, focus a little bit perhaps on transition, how that's important, why that's important in your schools, in your settings. How do you communicate the changes that are going to happen to your learners with additional learning needs? Do you consider learner voice? I know that's been raised already today. Do they have any say? Do learners with additional learning needs have any input when it comes to that transition process? And we think about Jean Ware's paper in particular that looks at practice in Wales. Think about the linguistic needs of children with additional learning needs. She refers to lack of Welsh medium provision. Is that something that you are experiencing, and what are you doing, if anything, about it? Do you know of resources that can help? She also refers to lack of resources and expertise in this particular area. So quite a few things for you to pick up on. So we'll give you, I think, what is the time? Shall we give you, yeah, we'll give you 10 minutes and then you can have a shorter time to feedback. So I'll just break out rooms now. I came across this paper by Fadjo, although related to practice in Indonesia. If you manage to have a read through it, it does relate really well to practice anywhere. And Fadri states that it's effective communication by teachers isn't just how they deliver content of a lesson, but knowing that individuals within the classroom have differing needs. Again, this has been touched upon. It doesn't mean that you then have to tailor everything that you do and say to individuals, but just to think about the way that you do deliver. Think about neurodiverse learners. Neurodiversity has been discussed this morning. They also talk about the importance of empathic communication. Again, this links to active listening, and it's more than just paying attention. It's communicating in a way that helps learners feel that their feelings, their needs are understood, that they're not being fobbed off, that we don't downplay their concerns, and using language that validates how it is they are feeling. And again, going back to paying attention to those non-verbal cues, because sometimes they are communicating how they are feeling through their body language, facial expressions, and so on. So simply by looking at the way that we deliver in lessons, how we communicate with our learners, we give our learners then with ALN this sense of worth, a sense of belonging. And I think that comes across in the earlier papers that you have access to now. Thank you. Diolch, Nana. And I'm aware of time. We've enjoyed ourselves, we've enjoyed each other's company so much. Again, we're going over time. So we won't use breakout rooms here. And I know you've been asked to create a PowerPoint slide, but don't worry if you haven't had time. What I would suggest is if you have and you're willing to share, that you put your links into the chat so we can see the sorts of things that you're using. But just together now, just in the last few minutes of the session, is there anybody who wants to share their critical evaluation of something specific you might use to support the communication needs of learners? Over to you.